Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Hague Talks. It's very nice to have you. This is a stage, obviously, and a meeting place for creative minds, for peace innovators, and for game changers. My name is Connor Satley. I'll be your moderator for the evening, a proud member of the peace and justice community in The Hague since 2016, but the Hague Talks predates me. As far as I can find, it goes back to 2014, so I'd like to start with a completely unapproved announcement that no one's expecting me to make, which is that this is the 10-year anniversary of the Hague Talks, which is kind of cool. Make sure you note down I might be told later that that's wrong, but I wanted to announce it to you myself. And what a better place to have such a great event than at Het Korenhuis in the heart of The Hague, at this beautiful venue. Well, there is one better place, which is in your living room. It's really nice that those of you who are watching online are joining us digitally. We've all gotten used to attending events from our sofas, so we're very jealous that you're able to experience that. But here in the room at Het Korenhuis, hard to find better than this anyways. So, the Hague Talks. It's a meeting place to share new ideas and perspectives. But it's also a starting point for concrete action. Over the last 10 years, some of the most brilliant minds in the world have come to The Hague to share their thoughts, their perspectives, and their experiences here at the Hague Talks. If you look up the Hague Talks on YouTube, you'll find former heads of state, you'll find movie stars, you'll find musicians, you'll find dancers and actors and actresses and everything in between speaking about what they experience in their journeys through peace and justice. This is a joint initiative of the Municipality of Den Haag and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this event is powered by the Humanity Hub and Integrity Initiatives International Europe, if it's a mouthful, III, even easier, and in partnership with Shelter City. So why are we here? Did you know that 5% of global GDP is lost each year to corruption? Just in 2024, I want to let you know about who has called for the creation of an international anti-corruption court. 50 former heads of state, 30 Nobel laureates, 350 former high court judges, cabinet ministers, NGO leaders, business leaders, and 100 civil society organizations call for this international anti-corruption court to promote transparency and accountability. But what does corruption mean for us? How does it materialize in our day-to-day lives? We can sit in a boardroom and discuss corruption in an abstract sense, come up with ideas to tackle it, but unless we consistently plug ourselves into what corruption actually means for the average person, not just here, but around the world, we'll stay lost in theory. By understanding which factors enable how, when, and in what shapes or forms corruption materializes, we believe anti-corruption can become a collective movement whereby we as engaged citizens can push for fairer systems of government and accountability. So this is what we're going to do today. Our program today consists of, first, an introductory speaker who will help set the scene. What are the major themes going on in anti-corruption, and how should we think about corruption? Let's define a few key terms, and let's define why it's an important topic to discuss. We'll then welcome 3 speakers to the stage, each with a completely different perspective and life experience on how corruption has impacted their lives and the lives of the people that they're working every day to help. Then we'll have a Q&A, including with our online folks, so don't hesitate to leave comments in the live stream if you have any questions. And with our audience here, we'll have a mic that gets passed around. It's a chance for you to engage with the speakers to dive into a particular part. We'll also, of course, bring all the speakers up afterwards, and I'll try to ask a few questions to draw some common threads between the speeches that you hear today. All right, so with that out of the way, is everybody ready for this new 10th anniversary, which I might be punished for, Hague Talks? That was a really nice round of applause. I deserve that as the moderator. But our speakers deserve just about 25% more. So let's practice once. Pretend you're welcoming a speaker. Kind of thought I deserved that too, but okay, we'll save it for the speaker. I think that's only fair. So for the first of our three speakers tonight, for our scene-setting speaker tonight, somebody to help define what is corruption and talk about why we're discussing this today. Please welcome an advocate of justice and integrity with a decade of leadership experience working to end grand corruption, the managing director of III Europe. Please welcome Sophie Gloos.
What do we mean when we talk about corruption? It's a term that stirs powerful images. Cash exchanged in dark rooms, secret deals sealed with a handshake. Perhaps it makes you think of newspaper headlines about political leaders embroiled in scandal, or of images of lavish lifestyles funded by public money, or crowds marching in protests demanding greater justice. Corruption stirs emotion of injustice and often outrage. It's a signal for the betrayal of the public trust. But what exactly is corruption? Corruption is more than a single crime. It's a web of unethical behaviors. It might be a bribe accepted, or a favor granted, or the use of public money for personal gain. But corruption is not always high profile. It ranges all the way from petty, small-scale corruption, like, for example, a bribe paid in exchange for access to basic services, to grand corruption, where entire institutions bow to the will of a few powerful individuals. Why should we care about corruption? It might seem like an issue that is distant to us. It might seem like an issue that is pervasive in other countries, faraway countries, perhaps marked by instability. Yet corruption reaches us all, including here in The Hague. A global city of peace, justice, and the rule of law, The Hague is home to institutions like the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, symbols for accountability and the rule of law. Yet corruption makes its way in through legal loopholes, through opaque financial systems, and through governance structures that lack transparency. The Netherlands, with its open financial systems, is particularly at risk for corruption. Each year, billions in illicit funds are channeled through this country. It's estimated that about 4.4 billion euros annually are lost of Dutch money alone. That's money that could fund schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. But beyond the financial loss, it is also the human cost of corruption that is severe. Corruption damages democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. When corruption is pervasive, citizens lose trust in the fairness of the institutions around them. They feel remote from political decision-making and from those who govern them. Corruption also increases inequality. It widens social disparity, and it can strip power from the most vulnerable people in our society. When citizens can no longer trust institutions, when the police and the courts are compromised, for example, then the basic social fabric is at fray. But there is good news. Across the world, the anti-corruption movement is growing. Investigative journalists, civil society organizations, law enforcement, and public policy makers are coming together to combat corruption. We actually owe a great deal to investigative journalists who, often at great risks to their own lives, uncover corruption. Their work sparks legal action and it sparks public awareness that is necessary to introduce systemic change. We're very fortunate to have one of these journalists with us here today, Tibelia, who will tell us more about his experience reporting from Eswatini. Our organization, Integrity Initiatives International Europe, was launched this summer to address the accountability gap, which is when powerful individuals escape justice. We work to establish an international anti-corruption court. And shortly, my colleague Inbal will tell you more about this court, including also how it could become a game changer in the fight against grand corruption. The movement against corruption is widening. We have governments and intergovernmental institutions embedding corruption into their policies. Public officials, business leaders, and ordinary citizens are demanding greater justice and accountability. One of these individuals is Buluma, who is pushing for greater public accountability and who will be speaking to us shortly. Realizing that corruption is pervasive is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. I hope that as we continue our discussions today, you'll feel inspired and think about what you personally can do to foster greater transparency, accountability, and justice in your own societies. The city is a symbol for accountability and justice, but also for our collective responsibility to uphold justice globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. As Sophie says, it's important that we keep in mind that corruption is not a consistently far away issue that we can tune out. Corruption will impact all of us and has certainly impacted many people in this room, which is why I'm very glad that we start with our next speaker, who is a former ICC lawyer and legal practitioner focused on the global push for an international anti-corruption court. Please join me in welcoming Inbal Jalowski. Inbal.
About 1.5 trillion US dollars are lost every year in bribes. That's roughly 2% of the global GDP. But that, of course, is not all of it. The real figure of the cost of corruption is much, much higher, as it includes other forms of corruption, like misappropriation of public resources, embezzlement, and money laundering. The global cost of corruption is estimated to be somewhere between 2 to 5% of the global GDP. To put that into perspective, the amount lost to corruption every year could feed the world's hungry 80 times over, in the words of the former High Commissioner of Human Rights, Nevi Pillay. But corruption cannot just be measured in cash. The cost of corruption is also, in real life, in irreparable harm to the environment, for example. Illegal destruction of rainforests, the oceans, wildlife trade, all of these things are rooted in corruption. The cost of corruption is also in loss of lives. Take, for example, the Rana Plaza disaster, a collapsed garment factory in Bangladesh that costed the lives of 1,100 people. Corruption is the thing that led to that massive tragedy. And that's just one example. Corruption undermines the social fabric of human societies. It deprives individuals and communities of their basic rights to freedom, education, health, sustainable development, and economic growth. It distorts and disrupts trust, safety, and security. Corruption, therefore, is not a victimless crime, and we are all victims of it. It is a problem for all of us to solve, and we must work together to address it. So why does corruption persist? Well, that's certainly not for lack of laws. Almost all of 191 countries who are members of the UN Convention Against Corruption have adopted legislation that criminalizes bribery, misappropriation of funds, money laundering, but that's clearly not enough. Senior leaders and senior public officials enjoy impunity from corruption because often they control the police, the prosecutions, the courts in their country, which themselves may be corrupt or may be subject to threats and intimidation. In other instances, we may find leaders who are willing to hold kleptocrats to account, but they lack the capacity to do so. These kind of cases are often transnational, very complex cases, and often involve extremely rich, powerful individuals. So the problem is really lack of institutions, or lack of independent institutions that are capable to enforce the laws. And this is where the International Anti-Corruption Court can fill that gap. An international anti-corruption court would investigate and prosecute complex cross-border corruption cases and bring kleptocrats to account. It would go after high-level senior officials and their co-conspirators, as well as their enablers and facilitators, such as bankers, lawyers, accountants. It would have jurisdiction over nationals of member states, but also over others who commit their crimes in whole or in part in the territory of a member state. So, for example, if a kleptocrat uses the infrastructure of a member state, let's say the Netherlands, to launder proceeds of crimes, that would be sufficient to link the crime and the individual and bring them under the jurisdiction of the International Anti-Corruption Court. In addition, the Anti-Corruption Court would be able to seize and repatriate and then repurpose the stolen assets to the benefits of corruption victims. The International Anti-Corruption Court is designed to achieve complementarity, which would create a ripple effect and would strengthen institutions and capacity globally. The complementarity principle means that the International Anti-Corruption Court would only prosecute and investigate where a member state is failing to do so, either because it is unable or unwilling to prosecute a case domestically. And by being a court of last resort, it creates a positive incentive for states to strengthen their institutions and build their capacity to address these kind of cases. It would also create a hub for anti-corruption professionals to share expertise and evidence and enhance enforcement efforts across the globe. So how do we make this a reality? The campaign to establish the International Anti-Corruption Court is gaining momentum. In June of 2021, 300 notable figures, including more than 80 former heads of states, presidents, and prime ministers, and 30 Nobel laureates, have signed a declaration calling for the establishment of the International Anti-Corruption Court. In 2023, the European Parliament have passed a resolution calling for the establishment of the International Anti-Corruption Court. And so far, countries like Canada, Ecuador, Colombia, Moldova, the Netherlands, and Nigeria have made commitments to work with international partners towards the establishment of the court. And many other countries have expressed interest as well. I have been fortunate enough to be part of an incredible group of pro bono experts who have come together to prepare the first complete zero draft of the treaty that would form the basis for the establishment of the court. This draft will soon be shared with governments and civil society partners for consultations. And with the valuable support of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we expect to share it further with interested governments and initiate the process that's required, the diplomatic process that's required in order to establish the court through the treaty. For this ambitious project to succeed, we need all of you, citizens of the world, to share the idea, support it, be part of the campaign, and push your governments to establish the International Anti-Corruption Court.
Thank you so much, Inbal. There's a few things that really struck me quite personally, which is that the cost of corruption is not always in money, it's also in lives. And I was thinking as we heard about this tremendous idea that for so many of us, international institutions were just always there. We weren't there when the UN was created or when the ICC was created, and it's just, at least me, sorry. It's a fascinating moment to stand here at the precipice of the creation of something like this, and it's so exciting to hear the vision on stage. So thank you so much. Once again, Inbal Jalowski. Now, we mentioned that each of our three speakers has different perspectives, different lives, a different approach, different thoughts, different experiences, and it's certainly true with all three of our speakers. So next, I'm going to welcome a journalist and an activist from Eswatini who has worked to shed light on stories of state and corporate violence and highlighting the impact of corruption on marginalized communities. Please join me in welcoming Tebehile Boisa. Tebehile, please.
Being in the warmth of your presence this evening is nice. Thank you for coming. I'm a journalist from a small country in Southern Africa, and I write about human rights abuses. I go to places where many journalists do not go, maybe because of time, maybe because of resources. And I sit with people who are victims of corruption, and I ask them to tell me their stories. I've visited the father of a son killed by a blast at a mine and listened as he told me how his son died, how he was pushed to take a metal bar and shovel explosives into a rock until the rock explodes and he burns to death. I am working on a story now up in the highlands of Eswatini. It's an old asbestos town that was in operation from 1938 until 2001. And then there was a process of liquidation that ended in 2004. And then a company that called itself Bulembu Development Company bought the town and its assets, claiming that they wanted to develop the town and rehabilitate it. But then they turned and became a Christian organization and invited orphans into the town. It's a town of orphans now, and they bring workers from all over the country, right besides the asbestos tailings. And they get a lot of funds from Canada, from everywhere. And now they want to go into the mine tailings and extract magnesium. And no one is talking about the human cost. If you go around Eswatini, especially in the Highveld, near Havelock, that's where the mine is, and talk to the people, the community there, the old people, they want to show you graves, They say there was a mine here, but it killed our people. But if you go to the National Archives in the city, there are no records. You have to go to England to even learn of the names of those who died. So I'm telling that story. It's a dangerous story to me, but it might save some lives in the long run. In May, I worked on a story about a mine, the Chinese mining inside a nature reserve without without due process. The king signed. He has all the powers. And when the stories came out, the mining stopped. But it is difficult work. It takes many, many hours. And one has to hide all the time. You live from a suitcase. But with a team, you get the stories out eventually. But it is work that needs a lot of support. But it is encouraging to see that when the journalism comes out, even in papers here in the West, people are interested. And I am very happy to be on this stage and to share more, perhaps, when we have drinks afterwards, about what I do. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. I've been working on it. I think it's so important that you're here. As a truth teller and as a storyteller, we need somebody to bring the stories to us here on this stage. Thank you so much for doing so. We look forward to welcoming you up again back later with Inbal and with our next speaker. So, corruption has many faces. We've already heard so much about the human face, about the diplomatic face, about where the international community can move to address this together. When we talk about governance and accountability, I think there's no one better than our next speaker to bring in, who's been working on governance and accountability for decades to talk about corruption from a development perspective, how corruption holds back governance and holds back development. Please welcome Buluma. Buluma, please join me.
Where do I start? I think it is best if I told you what corruption means to me as Buluma, in my capacity as an individual human being. Corruption is a disease, a malignant and highly infectious disease. It is also a very clever disease, one that is in a constant state of mutation in response to the remedies prescribed against it. The question then becomes, if it is a disease, do we have treatment? Do we have doctors? Do we have the resources for the doctors and that treatment? And all the other questions that come to mind when anyone and everyone is confronted with the diagnosis of disease. So let us unpack this disease called corruption so that we may understand it a little better. The first question, of course, becomes, how is this disease contracted? This disease called corruption is contracted when someone who is entrusted with power and authority abuses that power and authority for their own personal benefit. Let us take the example of a public servant. Note those two words, public servant. That means they are entrusted with power and authority by the public to serve the public. Let's further give this particular public servant the power and authority to approve construction permits. And in the course of their day-to-day duties, they come across an application for the construction of commercial premises on land that was set aside for the construction of a public hospital. The applicant then approaches the public servant with an inducement, usually money, because we all like money, to approve this particular application. In the course of that transaction, that is when this disease called corruption is contracted. The nature of government bureaucracies are such that for approvals, you require more than one signature. This public servant then goes ahead to recruit his or her colleagues within the department to approve this particular application. In that process, the disease called corruption is transmitted. Now remember that this land had been set aside for the construction of a public hospital, implying that public funds had been set aside for that particular project. Once you approve the construction of a commercial building, that means the public hospital will not be built. That now creates an opportunity for the embezzlement of the public funds which were set aside for the construction of the public hospital. And the pattern is, in any setting, is that if there's corruption in the one sector, in this particular situation, the health sector, then you'll find the similar instances in other sectors, the justice sector, agriculture sector, transport sector, and what have you. This disease called corruption not only afflicts those who are directly involved in it, but does a lot of collateral damage. Going back to our example, once the construction of a commercial building is approved, that means there'll be no public hospital in that particular area. What this means, especially in resource-poor settings, is that the residents of that area will have poorer health outcomes. We are talking about poorer health outcomes in terms of maternal and neonatal health. We are talking about poorer health outcomes in terms of sexual and reproductive health. We are talking about poorer health outcomes in terms of communicable and non-communicable diseases, and so on and so forth. Also, the fact that this particular issue happens within that locality translates to poorer health outcomes for the region, for the country, and the same can be told up to the global level. This is the infectious nature of this particular disease called corruption. And its infectiousness is made even more attractive by the lure of the inducement, usually money. I'll repeat again, we all like money. So then the question becomes, how do we fight this particular disease called corruption? Allow me to focus on the role played multilateral organizations such as the International Development Law Organization where I currently serve. And also, to some extent, the proposed International Anti-Corruption Court, which has been spoken about by my colleague who came here on stage before me. At the International Development Law Organization, IDLO for short, our mission statement is that we are exclusively devoted to promoting the rule of law. Breaking down the rule of law to its basic components, it is simply the fact that everybody must be equally accountable before the law. And everybody here means people like you and me, institutions, all the institutions we can think about, as well as states, entire countries. We all must be equally accountable to the law and before the law. So IDLO and other organizations of the same manner come in to support states to ensure accountability to the law and before the law by people, institutions, as well as the state itself. How does it do this? Or how do similar organizations do this? They do this by coming in to support states, for instance, to develop the capacity of the institutions as well as the people in those institutions to hold those who are guilty of, although the fact is that we all presumed innocent until proven guilty, to hold to account anybody and everybody who's involved in corruption. So you work with prosecutorial agencies, investigative bodies, as well as judicial agencies to develop their capacities so that when instances of corruption occur, they can prevent, detect, investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate corruption and economic crimes. Corruption also has adverse effects to vulnerable groups. For instance, women and girls and other vulnerable populations. So such organizations come in to ensure equal application of the law, especially in regard to corruption practices. For instance, working to ensure justice for women and girls. More importantly, such organizations come in within the community to empower people in that community not only to hold people, institutions, and even states accountable before the law when corruption occurs, but also to enable them to know what is corruption, when corruption occurs, where do I report, and how do I follow up. Over time, IDLO and other organizations that are similar-minded have come up with several methodologies that do work. Allow me to share but a few. First of all, let's agree that if the institutions of the country is going to be accountable in this fight against corruption, we must have the right people in place in those organizations. This is where we have what we call merit-based selection, such that at the point of recruitment, in addition to your professional qualifications, we are assessing your levels of integrity, so that when you are sent to that particular position of power and authority, your integrity is such that, to an extent, you are incorruptible. And this has been successful in countries like Ukraine before the conflict, Armenia and Moldova, to speak of others. Remember, I also say that corruption is a disease that is very clever and mutates constantly. In our present world today, digital technology is evolving at a rate that even I myself can no longer keep up with, and I gave up trying to keep up with. But the criminals and perpetrators, even for corruption and economic crimes, are way ahead of the game. So then, such institutions come in to support states, to capacitate institutions and people to be able to leverage these digital technologies, especially with regard to corruption and economic crimes. A good example is with the process of corruption and economic crimes. Right now, people are no longer going to hide the process of corruption through paper money. They convert them into cryptocurrencies, transfer them beyond the reach of many jurisdictions. So capacitating institutions and people to be able to follow the money, as well as use that particular digital evidence in court. Examples of where IDLO does this is Indonesia. Finally, briefly so, these institutions, people, and countries need to be having in place laws and policies that allow them to successfully execute their mandates. So IDLO and other like-minded institutions support states to develop the relevant laws and policies that can help them combat corruption and economic crimes. Examples of IDLO abound across the world. We're talking of Kenya, the Bahamas, Honduras, and other examples that you may encounter. This is where I also want to come in and plug in for the International Anti-Corruption Court. It is needed because corruption, especially grand corruption, what we call grand corruption is simply people whom we term in our world politically exposed persons have a lot of influence, not only financial, but even political and even just social, such that when you try to hold them to account, they mobilize all this influence to defeat any attempts at holding them to account within their respective countries. So we need a global recourse, such as the International Anti-Corruption Court, as my colleague who was here earlier on explained, and we shall be indulging more in after. To conclude, to round it all up, I've talked about institutions, I've talked about countries, I've talked about organizations. But then, what can we do to assist in this fight against corruption? We, meaning yourself, myself, as people who are affected and infected by this disease called corruption. Let me go back to the example we began with of that particular approval of the commercial building. The residents of that particular area, hypothetically speaking, could be me and you. Doesn't necessarily have to be a commercial building, it can be anything. Even something as mundane as bringing down trees that have been there for 100 years old to construct a road that we don't agree with. What we can do at the individual level, as they could have done at that level, raise a petition to your representatives at the municipal level, local level, government level, for the revocation of such approval. The parliamentary representatives on their part, they have the power and the authority, as well as the municipal representatives, to actually revoke such permits when they are given, and also enforce or develop laws to prevent recurrence of such occurrences of corruption in the future, and recommend sanctions against those involved. Upon recommending sanctions, the institutions, law enforcement agencies come into play to investigate, prosecute, adjudicate those particular cases, and hold those particular people, institutions to account. And of course, all other non-human members of society, non-human meaning private sector, NGOs, CSOs, INGOs, multilaterals, bilaterals, all the acronyms you think about. They can come in to support the communities, one, in terms of awareness of when to detect corruption when it occurs, and also to support the development of reporting mechanisms. It occurs, how can I report? How can I follow up? How can I hold it to account? I'm here today to tell you all that we all have a role to play. So let's play it well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Buluma. You're going to notice behind me some chairs being set up. Give us 2 minutes as we set up to welcome our speakers back. In the meantime, Buluma, yes, I think your intervention touched me very deeply. I think the metaphor of a disease, of an infectious disease with collateral damage, with real impact, is very meaningful, I think, and helps us to put into context what we're talking about today. We're going to welcome all of our speakers up on stage in just a moment. As we do so, I was struck by revisiting the scene setting that Sophie gave at the beginning of this event, where she talked about corruption is not just a faraway concept. It hits on a personal level, and it's critical to talk about on an international level. And I think with our 3 speakers, we delved into that. With Inbal, we talked about the push for the International Anti-Corruption Court and how governments and heads of state are coming together to figure out new mechanisms to combat corruption. We also heard stories about speaking to the father of someone who was killed in a mine collapse because of corruption. The most significant and deep human cost of corruption from Tebehile. I'm going to get it. Just my tongue swells when I try. And Buluma, I think you helped wrap up the conversation so well in giving us this vision of a disease, something that needs to be addressed, that needs to be cured, otherwise continues to metastasize, continues to expand. So thanks so much. Will you join me in giving a big round of applause to all three of our speakers today at the Hague Talks? And I did a very magical moderator trick, which is that the chairs have appeared behind me with nobody helping me at all. I am really good at this. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, whoever else was helping. There were two people. So I would like to welcome once again all of our three speakers on stage. There's a lot of common links between these talks that you just heard, so we're going to take just a few minutes to draw these threads out. If you have an audience member, have a question, get one in your mind. We'll be passing around a mic in just a little bit. So please welcome on stage Inbal, Tebehile, and Buluma. Please come join me. Grab a seat.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Deep breath. The talk is over. I sense some stress just released. But I'm so glad that the three of you were our speakers today. I'm so glad that we had this variety of perspectives, that we covered the international, the diplomatic, all the way down to the cost of a life. This span of the conversation, I think, was really touching to experience. And so I guess I want to ask a question and have the three of you weigh in. I noticed a few threads that went through all three of your presentations, which were about, on one hand, the international, this broad coalition being built to tackle this. But on the other hand, the personal cost of corruption. How do you think we in the room should walk away thinking about this dichotomy, this on one hand, we must come together as an international society to tackle corruption. But on the other hand, if we truly want to understand it, we must understand the individual. I'm curious where your thoughts lie on this dichotomy. It's a tough question. Who wants to jump in first?
I will take it.
Please.
It is difficult for victims, for indigent victims in communities, to get justice domestically, because they are abusers. The people they are victims to have political protection. So you definitely need a court, and Eswatini definitely needs a court. Because we have a king who's been in power since 1986. He was 18 when he became king, and inherited a dictatorship. Even though we have a constitution now promulgated in 2005, things have only gotten worse. And the only help, I am positive, will come from the international scene, perhaps from SADC processes in the region, and then to the court here in The Hague.
What a transition. We have two people here that are working on this international concept. What does this mean to you when you hear about your work as something that might be hopeful to the victims of this in being able to address their perpetrators?
Yeah. So there's, I think one of the things that's coming up from all of these talks is really this elusive nature of corruption and how difficult it is to make the link between, invisible victims, really, for us sitting here in the Netherlands, in the part of the world that seems very far, very unrelated to our daily life, and what's happening here, and between the actual perpetrators of grand corruption crimes, right? So, and I think this is really where an international anti-corruption court can come in to conduct these kind of very challenging investigations and shed light on this area that's so difficult for us to individually point to in different parts of this chain, right? But each part, of course, is crucial. And I have to say, I admire the work that you do when you bring out these stories. And I appreciate also the personal risk and cost that's involved in that.
Buluma, you helped us bridge this gap, the international, but then also the reality. So let me give you a moment to be the cynic. If the international court works, will it provide relief? Will it actually help the average person?
Aha. Where do I begin? I think it's needed. I think it's timely. And I think it's something that should come to fruition. Going back to what my colleagues have talked about in terms of those who are most affected by corruption, they will only get redress when they feel, of course, it's good to have those who are perpetrators being put to account, but when they feel that in their individual situations, we have mechanisms that can prevent corruption from occurring or recurring. My gospel, wherever I go, because I work on the criminal justice system, is that it's a chain, like she said. And people focus on the investigative, prosecutorial, and adjudicative parts of the chain. But to me, the greatest link in that chain is the preventive part. If you can prevent it from happening, not only for corruption, but any crime, if you can prevent it from happening, that has the greatest impact on the person who is a potential victim of not only corruption, but any crime. So, yes, it is needed. Yes, it is timely. But let us not forget that for the greatest impact to those who are affected or infected by corruption, if we can prevent it from happening, that's when they'll most feel it.
I tried to paint you as a cynic, and you came back as a realist. I like it. Thank you, Buluma. One more question that I want to explore, and then we'll take some questions from the audience and from our live stream. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in chat. It talks about collateral damage. Now, this is Buluma's term, so I'll start with Buluma. Tell us a little bit more about how we can broaden our perception of corruption to not just be handing a police officer a little bit of cash out the window to get out of a ticket, but that corruption is a broader concept that has more damage than simply to the wallet. Help us understand and frame this a little bit more.
It's very good that we're in the Netherlands and in The Hague in particular, because my example is centered to the Netherlands and The Hague. And the Hagians, if I may call them that, who are present today, will recall immediately after COVID when the restrictions were lifted and everybody, because we had been home for a long time, wanted to travel. And we had all the issues at Schiphol. And the lines were all the way, even beyond the parking lot. And individuals who could actually get to those in position of power and authority could maneuver and not have to queue. That affects, I'm trying to bring it home to people who are far from resource-poor settings. But that costs you time, that costs you money in terms of missed flights, that costs you stress, that costs you aggravation, that costs you anger, that costs you your peace. Because you're there, you've come on time, but somebody else has managed to talk to somebody who can, jump them ahead of the queue. We speak about people in position of power and authority. We're thinking about people who make decisions based on money. But it's something as simple as that I'm here in the queue, somebody can have somebody else who came after me go ahead of me and benefit. So in that manner, that's the collateral damage I'm talking about. Time, expense, aggravation, anger. Those who are here during that time, the anger especially. That's an example of the collateral damage.
Inbal, and yes, please. I would love to hear your perspectives as well, please.
I think an important element of the proposal is that from the proceeds of these crimes, there will be compensation. This is new. There are, of course, comparative examples. After apartheid, South Africa convened a TRC, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and victims of apartheid were compensated, some of them. And I'm happy to learn that this International Anti-Corruption Court will have that, that element ingrained. I think that's important. It's good to learn that. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this is quite an important element that is being worked on, and there's a lot of focus on how to do that and build into the structure of the court also an assets chamber that would exclusively deal with the issue of seizing, repatriating, and repurposing these funds, the stolen assets, to bring them back to the benefit of the victims, indeed. So that's a very important focus area in the work on the draft treaty for the Anti-Corruption Court. I also wanted to react to what you said, Buluma, about the importance of prevention, and I fully agree with that. But to me, there's two sides to it. So I think it's extremely important to prevent, but the deterrence is also important. And it's a little bit like the carrot and the stick, right? You need both reforms to build institutions, address the supply side of corruption, which is, where it's easier to prevent. So when you mentioned the example of the hospital, so if you do proper due diligence and you manage to prevent corruption in that project, you've managed to deal with the supply side of it. But the demand side of corruption, which is where the stolen funds land, right? To deal with that, it's still very necessary to have very strong deterrence. So people know that if they request these bribes or if they put their hands on public resources, there may be consequences to that. So I see these things really kind of well interlinked and part of the same effort to address corruption.
And Kona, that's why now I can be a cynic.
Please.
Because I kept on saying that the inducement is usually money, and we all love money. And you see the nature of corruption money, that it comes when you need it and you don't have it. So someone in another setting once said that we need to tackle the culture of greed, which is very hard because it's human nature to be greedy. So that's also another element to think about. We don't think about it in our interventions, but at the core of it is greed.
Sure. And equitable economic development in the first place. If you're able to make sure that actual economic development impacts everybody and rises all boats, one of the most powerful things I learned is that police uniforms can be a tremendously powerful anti-corruption tool. Because if the police don't need to get some bribes to take their uniforms, then there's less bribes needed. So also equitable economic development, fair wages, transparency, I think is smart as well. We've got another cynic on stage with us, except that they're in the live stream. So it's about this preventative nature of an international criminal court. And on the live stream, feel free to put your questions into chat or message our moderator directly. This one goes into the moderator. We have a state-of-the-art system where I'm WhatsApping with our folks in the tech booth to find out what's going on in the chat. Super high-tech, but we've got the question here. And the question surrounds the preventative nature of the anti-corruption court. And it casts some dispersions on this idea that if I am a head of state or a minister of justice or a head of police or a head of economic or educational development, and that I'm thinking about putting my hands on the money and taking it. Oops, but it might be mine. But now I know there's an international court. Is the concept that this person will change their thinking because there's this international court, that there will be an opportunity to take some money there, take the power, but that they will choose not to in a preventative way because of an international court? I sense some skepticism from our online commenter. I'm curious, maybe Inbal, could I start with you? It's a rough one, but maybe one you get a lot. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a very philosophical question that goes to the core of criminal justice, right? So it would be applicable to any crime, really. Would a perpetrator of a crime avoid the crime if they know that this would have consequences? I think in the majority of the instances, the answer is yes. But of course, having a criminal justice system doesn't prevent all crime. And still we have to deal with the consequences of crimes, and that includes restoring justice, not just punishing. And these things are not mutually exclusive. So I think we really need to think in a wholesome way about the system that we are creating, so it would achieve both deterrence and restoration to victims.
I see some nods from your colleagues on the stage here. It seems to have resonated.
Yeah. When you are in a small place, in a small district, in an insignificant part of the world, and there's a big man with all the powers, where do you go?
The International Anti-Corruption Court.
Where do you go?
You go to the big man.
You go to the big man. You draw strength from where there's strength.
Yeah. And I'll draw it all the way back to what Nobel said about deterrence. Deterrence works best when people have seen what happens, when people who have, breached the law, what happens to them. They always remember what happened to them. And the examples abound of instances whereby if international mechanisms came in the initial time and were effective, then subsequently the population in that particular jurisdiction is always aware, and even the political are always aware that should I cross this line, they will come for me and they will do to me like they did to X. So having that international mechanism, like he said, as a last resort, also the big man sits back and says, okay, fine, I'm a big man here, but I'll go before a court of big men, and I won't be a big man no more.
I like it. Can we put that on some of the International Anti-Corruption Court marketing material? This is very good. So we have Emma with some mics who's ready to pass them around. If we're ready to take some questions from the audience. I have these super bright lights in my eyes, but here we go. I can see you now. We have a hand raised on this side. We have two hands raised on this side. Okay, it's time for me to shut up. We've got a lot of questions here. So Emma, there she is. She's coming. Here on the right in the white sweater. Hello. I can see mainly bright or dark colors. That's all I've got. Yes, hello.
Hello. First, I would like to thank you for the presentation. My question is linked to what you were mentioning. So, according to your presentation, you said that the biggest problem is definitely the accountability and the implementation. So, it's not a question of legal framework to implement, but more how to put it at the domestic level or how to prosecute those people. So, how your court that is based on the complementarity principle would be different from the ICC, where we can find and observe that the implementation is relative. And my second question would be, why not concentrating yourself on the economical actors and not necessarily the politicians in order to help, to acquire more, not agreement, but support from the states? Because as the journalist highlighted it, most of the time it's multinationals that are involved in those crimes. So perhaps it might be also interesting. Thank you.
Those are two really excellent questions. They're good enough that you should deserve to introduce yourself really quick. What's your name and where are you from?
I'm from France. I'm Emma Chikongo, and I wrote my master's thesis on human trafficking and the impact of the corporation in it.
It's lovely to have you. Thank you for the questions. Those are two good ones. Let's start with those. So there's The first question, I'm really sorry, they're brilliant questions. I'm going to paraphrase slightly, just start yelling if I got them wrong, is about, okay, legal frameworks are clear for the International Anti-Corruption Court, but what about implementation, accountability at the domestic level so that it doesn't end up an advisory or conceptual court internationally? And second is, nice we go after politicians, what about multinationals? What about the economic actors that commit corruption too? So I open the floor. Does anybody want to jump in on either one of those?
Sure, I can address the questions. So I'll start with the second one. So certainly, the current thinking about who is this court going to go after is not just the senior leaders themselves or senior public officials, but also the enablers. So these actors who enable and facilitate the crime, such as bankers, accountants, etc. As far as criminal responsibility is involved, we are looking at individual criminal responsibility at this point. There is some thinking about corporate responsibility as well, but as far as I'm aware, this is more focused around civil procedure. So the court, as envisaged at the moment, will have both criminal chamber and an assets chamber, where civil procedures can also take place, and then that could involve indeed corporate actors too. For your first question, and I think it's a great question, how do we make sure that this court is not doesn't end up as just a theoretical exercise that's falls short of expectations, and how would it be different from the ICC? And certainly, within the group of experts who are drafting the treaty, we are looking at the ICC model on the one hand as an example for something that states have already agreed to. So it shows us kind of like a benchmark of what member states would accept in terms of perhaps coming from the perception of how much of their sovereignty they will be willing to give away to a court like this. But at the same time, we are also really thinking on how can we push that boundary and make some leap forwards in terms of how can we rethink, for example, the cooperation model of the ICC, so that the model that we will have for the International Anti-Corruption Court will work better. And so it's a bit of a balancing act at this point. How far can we push it, but to the point that it will still be accepted? But definitely, I think there's a lot of innovative ideas there that will have to be part of the proposal.
Luba, as well, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, thank you, especially on the second question, politically, going after the political actors and other institutions. If you'll recall in the presentation, I stated that everyone must be equally accountable before the law. And in everyone, I classified people, institutions, as well as states. And I like that Inbal has brought in that it will also have the criminal element in terms of the court, as well as the civil element. Now, I not only work on this area in programming, but I also work on it in terms of research. And in countries where we have civil forfeiture, for institutions, especially the enablers, banks, financial institutions, etc., you hit them where it hurts the most in terms of fines, sanctions, monetary, whereas then they have to go back to their shareholders and the board and explain that we got hit this much because we engaged in A, B, C, D. Next time, they won't engage in the same. So having it parallel will also have a great effect. It has had a great effect in individual countries which practice the criminal process in terms of going after the perpetrators, but also the civil process in terms of going after the institutions. So the two together work perfectly. And they can work, have worked, and will work.
Okay, shall we take another question?
Another one.
Okay, so we have many to get through. So Emma, you're yes. Let's go one more on the right here, and then we'll come over to the left. I see hands raised all the way down the aisle. Hello.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for this great talk. And so my name is Adriana Marin. I'm from Venezuela. I'm very happy to see here some friends from Justice and Peace, by the way. And my question is more, going back to the prevention side. So I come from one of the most corrupted countries in Latin America, and perhaps the world. And something that it triggers me, I also did a thesis, a master thesis, by the way, about how corruption affects migration, or is a push factor for migration. And I recall that from my interviews, corruption can be so structural that you just simply don't recognize that you're a victim of it. For example, clientelism. I believe that, I don't know if that was mentioned here, for example, many people are very happy to receive presents from their presidents, from their governments, and so on, but no one really thinks about the fact that they've been following corruption acts too. So my question is around, I think that this is part of prevention and raising awareness on identifying acts of corruption. So is this institution that you were talking about, does it have, at least in the roadmap, any sort of prevention mechanism working directly with, let's say, NGOs, grassroots institutions in countries that are highly corrupted? Because in the end, what happens is, as someone who also experienced these sort of situations, is that it's sort of like you learn to be hopeless, basically. And you think that no one is really going to help you. So I believe that if these sort of mechanisms are set in place, it could be really beneficial, either through social media, either through contacting, people in your local area, and so on. And in that way, there could be some meaningful collective action to really hold those who are doing corruption, not only top line. So yeah, that's pretty much the question, and thank you so much again.
Thank you, and thanks for sharing your story and perspective with us as well. As I said, this is a place for a discussion, so we really appreciate it. So yeah, the question is, it still comes back to then local implementation. And I'm curious if this jumped out for one of you that you want to respond to the story, perspective, question that was asked.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. The concept, it's called learned helplessness. It's because it has been going on for a while. You don't know that it's wrong. You'll find that in certain areas, certain jurisdictions, people know that to access a public service, aside from the cost of the public service, I have to pay corner. And it's actually budgeted for, because that's what happens. It's learned helplessness. Corner doesn't know. I'm using Corner as an example. Because right now he's in a position of power and authority. Corner doesn't know it's wrong. I don't know it's wrong. Learned helplessness. So we proceed in this manner. So what we do in such instances is to create awareness, both within the institutions and officers in that institution, such as Corner, that this is actually qualifies as a corrupt practice, and within the community to know that Corner really shouldn't be given that extra on the side. And you'll be amazed, because some of the things are taken for granted. Even, let me go back to the issue of the health facility. You feel that upon the doctor performing his duty to treat you, you have to treat him, chicken, cows, goats, as a gift, which is good. However, over time, it becomes that the doctor will not treat you if he doesn't get the chicken, cow, or goat. So it's all an issue of awareness. And this is the thing with law. Most people don't know they're breaking the law until they are told this is what the law says, this is how the law is broken, this is how the sanctions are when you break that law. So awareness is a key part, and I like that you mentioned prevention. Awareness is a key part of prevention, because at the end of the day, most people don't know. But now on the other side, lawyers, Inbal, myself, lawyers in the crowd, we know that ignorance of the law is not a defense, but people don't know that. Yeah.
And maybe just to complement the answer, coming back to the vision of the International Anti-Corruption Court, it's definitely, it's the type of cases that we are talking about will require very close cooperation between prosecutors and investigators at the international level and domestic levels of multiple jurisdictions. So I think it will definitely be, one of the ripple effects of the court, even beyond the complementarity principle that I mentioned before, that there will be capacity building and enhanced efforts also at different domestic jurisdictions as a result of this kind of work.
Yeah, it's a good standard to aspire to. Building systems of justice takes time. It requires a lot of diplomacy. Governments do not just relinquish control, a little bit of sovereignty, and we're good. No. To have the proposal as the first stage, and to have these conversations, and to have a standard to aspire to, I think is good. And to begin to build these institutions that will make this work possible at the domestic level. Yeah, I think that's what I can say about that.
Thanks. Let's get some questions from this side of the audience. We have, there were some folks who raised their hands over here, I saw. One down in the front here. Emma? Oh, and somebody up above. Yes, one here and then up in the back.
Hi. My question is on Truth and Reconciliation Commission idea, and the idea of this court having a public-facing restitution, vindication sort of aspect to it. Because, for example, in the work that I do on digital fluency, and then also I was a clothing designer for decades when it was made in the US and then made in China over that arc. And so I've seen plenty of the systems of corruption. And then when I became a peace builder, and of course I loved I studied in depth the power of the truth and reconciliation process. I think so much of our courts are about the punitive side that we then kind of like go off the cliff when it comes to the sort of essence of what does it feel like to be vindicated. And that's a very powerful force, because you feel like you didn't waste your time if you do receive vindication. So I wondered if that was going to be a part of the design.
So I'm not sure I fully understand the question in the sense that, the concept of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as far as I know, it is more, been practiced in the context of crimes against humanity, war crimes, so mass violence incidents, where there's really been, a lot of hate between different parts of society, and that's when reconciliation or kind of like these public proceedings take place. We haven't really thought about it in terms of, a concept like this to really be built explicitly in these terms into the concept of the International Anti-Corruption Court beyond what I've already mentioned. So, there will be an assets chamber that would be able to seize these funds and repatriate them to the benefit of victims of corruption. But it's a really interesting idea that, perhaps as a result of this conversation, I can bring it back to the group to brainstorm about that. Yeah.
And it's much needed, and it's the final step. You see, in other parts of the world, restorative justice is a big part of the justice system, as opposed to just focusing on the accused and sanctioning the accused and imprisoning the accused. And in the absence of the International Anti-Corruption Court at present, there are instances when money has been traced, obtained through corruption and economic crimes, the proceeds of, and then the repatriation process itself, in terms of now where the money was stolen from. How do we take care of that? This money was stolen from people in a particular part of the world. This money has been found, lots of it. The one who stole it is long dead or long gone. The cases are there, you can Google them. How do we get that money back to the people? Right now, most countries are struggling with that, because most countries are, in terms of corruption now, aside from the International Corruption Court, we have asset tracking and recovery. The recovery part, when the money goes back, You see, when it goes back to a government which may or may not be ready to handle such money. And then it's, the cycle continues.
Right.
So that's something that,
Right.
as we brainstorm going ahead with the court, we need to think about.
Yeah.
Because that money was stolen from me, you, him, all of us.
Yeah.
If it comes back, it should now come back to me, you, all of us.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's a fantastic idea and something for consideration, and it's what makes the Hague Talks special, right? I think it's an interesting, even as I heard you describing what the peace and reconciliation process is about. Yeah, it sounds like that's quite necessary indeed. So I think an interesting conversation to carry forward. Let's take another question up here. Emma? Yes?
Yeah, my name is Kanja, and I'm from Kenya. About this is a very sensitive topic, you know, and having to listen to all three speakers, we still come back to money being the root cause of corruption, you know, and you find out that if money has the strength to create this corruptive platform, what about the people? What about taking the power to the people? Because where power is taken to the people, then money loses value. Then corruption becomes controllable. That is my view. I don't know whether it's a question or it's something to add on what you people are saying or you people are talking about.
After we did the story about mining in the nature reserve in May, so many people read the story even in the poor communities where there was a lot of harm. You know, parts of the story are complicated because we're looking into how the laws were broken. But in many countries, even in dictatorships, because of international instruments from the UN and other multilateral organizations, many aspects of life have been legislated, and states are obligated to follow the law, otherwise there will be consequences. So if the population knows about that, you know, they read the story and they know about that and they can be organized around, that in itself is power. But that's a lot of work that has to be done. You know, we have to be optimistic.
And I think we have to support the work of independent journalists who are going out and exposing this work, like yourself. So it's a perspective I'm so glad to hear, and a fantastic intervention. Thank you. Buluma, Inbao, want to jump in on this? Or?
Yeah. There's a term in physics, it's called critical mass, achieving critical mass, you know, when you have the neutron and, you know, that's what powers the hydrogen bomb, the nuclear bomb, and so on. It applies to human beings, people like you're talking about. When we achieve critical mass such that all people who are affected and infected by corruption are so fed up with it, they decide to act. Because at the end of the day, in any society, the people are the sovereign. They wield the sovereign power. I mean, all these people we elect represent us. So when the people achieve critical mass with regard to corruption, and they agitate for changes in the law, they agitate for all these people we think have more power to be held accountable to the law. When you achieve that critical mass, you'll be able to achieve instances where you're able to succeed in the fight against corruption. And it's happening in areas across the world, including where the speakers came from.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Well, I have good news and I have bad news. The bad news is, for this moment, this part of the event is going to be over here on stage. But the good news is we are going to continue the conversation. I know that there's many questions still. I see hands in the air. If it can be a really quick one, we can take one more. I see one really insistent question, so we can't stop if someone's this insistent.
Good
Yes, please.
evening,
Hello.
everybody. My name is Elfrida Sharif. I'm from Liberia, and I work in international development like Buluma there, and I'm very much interested in corruption. So I get to the question quick. Regarding the court, right, we have the ICC. So how fair is it going to be, especially for us in Africa? We say, okay, you guys only, maybe you have Charles Taylor and you actually only go after those in Africa, for example. So how fair is it going to be? What measures are you guys going to put in place so that we say, oh, okay, it's working across the board and it's not only working for those who, are not in high positions or those who are not, popular and all of that? How fair is it going to be? What measures are you going to put in place so we don't feel like, okay, it's only targeting those in Africa and they don't target anybody else? And then how are you going to go about it? Say, for example, you pick someone in Africa, right? And say, okay, we're going after this person for corruption. And would you go through the courts? In whether it's Nigeria or Liberia or Ghana, would you go through the courts? Because the court system there is going to be corrupt. So how are you going to get the cases, what path is it going to take to get there? Is it going to go through maybe regional bodies like ECOWAS or any other regional body? What's going to happen there? That's just it. And just my third point is for Puluma, when we said, sometimes people are ignorant. And I'm not going to speak for East Africa, but I think when it comes to corruption, it's almost so entrenched that people do know what they're doing, because no police officer or anybody that works at government ministry go and do a bribe and come back and brag about it. Like, oh, guess what I did today? I took a... So we're like ignorance of the law is not an excuse. So they do know what they're doing, and there has to be just very serious deterrence against that. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Well, the extra question was definitely worth it, and something that I want to hear the answer to. So what resonates with you that you wanted to jump in on there?
Sure, I can take the first two, perhaps. There were 3 questions, by the way. So on the fairness, or rather, the fear of selective justice, I guess the answer would have 2 parts. First of all, it's definitely on the top of our minds on how to make sure that this court doesn't focus its attention only on some parts of the world or some type of cases or individuals. I think, as Sophie mentioned earlier, corruption is not a unique problem in Africa. It exists also in Europe. It exists elsewhere in the world. And certainly the court will have to take seriously the problem anywhere where it happens. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, just like in the ICC, I think it's very important that also the IACC will have appropriate representation and participation of people from the Global South, so that the court itself has to embody that kind of citizen power. So it has to really reflect, the vision that it's there to protect the citizens from corruption, and then it's a global court in the way that it belongs to everyone. And then finally, perhaps just a word about the ICC. I'm a former prosecutor at the ICC, and so it perhaps a bit diverging from the main topic here. But I just want to throw in, that I feel that sometimes the criticism on the ICC, that it over-focuses on Africa, is a little bit unfair. And, and indeed, I think in the first years of the ICC, it had most of its cases in Africa. But those cases in the early years, in fact, were referred to the court by the states themselves. So they were self-referrals from African states. And then later on, as the court gained more experience, and if you look nowadays at what the court is doing, it actually has open investigations and cases in different parts of the world, in Asia, in Central Asia, Georgia, Myanmar, Philippines, in Latin America, in Palestine. So in fact, I don't think the criticism, even at the ICC, is no longer valid. So that's just my personal opinion on that.
Puluma, do you want to weigh in on this as well?
The last one. That's why I emphasize the question of land helplessness. Land helplessness is where you know that you can do better, but you've been conditioned to know that this is the only option you have. For instance, if Connor were to tell us that this is the only door we can exit from, because he was told by somebody before him, was told by somebody before him, we all know there must be another door. But because we've all become helplessly learned to that particular issue, that's all we'll use. So it's not ignorance per se, it's learned helplessness. The police officer, his learned helplessness is that he has to supplement his salary by the additional resources he gets. The citizen is having learned helplessness to know that he or she can only get services from the police officer by giving extra incentive. We can even go to developed countries. Some countries have this culture of tipping, where you're paying wait staff below the required wage, on the mindset that the tips will make up for the shortfall. So, and as human beings, like any other being on this planet, once we are conditioned into a certain routine, that is all we'll follow. Not necessarily ignorance, but learned helplessness. We've learned it over time, and we've just decided this is what it is, this is what it's going to be.
So I want to wrap us up with Tebehile. So can you leave us with a thought, leave us with your perspective on how we should combat this learned helplessness that Buluma talks about, how we can inform ourselves about what's going on with corruption in our own communities?
Maybe to just build on what they were talking about, there might, of course, be an imbalance. It might be true. But I think it's time we fight also for equity in application, and it is possible to do that. But the important thing is the acknowledgement that this tool is necessary and that it is a standard to aspire to. And then let's do the dirty work to make it happen.
A big thank you to Buluma, to Inbal, to Tebehile. Please give us a big warm round of applause.
Thank you.
And a big thanks as well to the Humanity Hub for powering this event, for Shelter City, for Impact EI, for Triple I, for the Municipality of The Hague, and for our great tech team in the back, Holland Park Media, and to Sophie for setting the scene for us. Sophie Kloos, thanks so much. We're so happy that you came to join us here, and we're thrilled to welcome you back to the next Hague Talks. So to find out when the next Hague Talks is, you've got to follow the Humanity Hub on social media and keep in touch with what's going on. There's a lot of events going on in peace and justice, and we'd just love to see you here back for the next one. Now, as I said, the good news is it's not over yet. Every single Hague Talks ends with the conversation continuing outside, so it's your chance to come and yell at Iqbal about the anti-corruption court, to hear the stories from Eswatini that will blow your mind. They're incredible. To talk to Buluma about learned helplessness and the disease of corruption, how it spreads. So those of you who didn't get the chance to ask your questions, don't worry, there's still an opportunity. We'd love if you would join us for a drink, and we wish you a very nice night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good job, guys. Hey, great job. Thank you so much.